My name is Alicia. In the circles Malcolm frequents, the glass-walled boardrooms of Manhattan and the mahogany-scented lounges of the Upper East Side, my name is whispered like a secret that everyone wishes to forget. I am the smudge on his polished glass, the static in his perfect frequency. To the world, I am the supportive wife of a rising star. To Malcolm, I am a ghost that smells of sautéed garlic and domestic failure. The clock on the bedside table hasn't even thought of ticking toward 4 a.m. when I slip out from under the Egyptian cotton sheets. I move with the practiced silence of a thief, though I am only stealing time to serve. The house is a cold, architectural masterpiece of minimalism, but the kitchen is my workshop of devotion, or perhaps my altar of sacrifice. By the time the first gray light of a New York winter bleeds through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the kitchen is alive. I am preparing his world, so he doesn't have to encounter a single friction point in his day. I squeeze the juice from organic oranges, the zest stinging the small cuts on my cuticles. I poach eggs to a precise, trembling consistency that he demands but never acknowledges. My hands move mechanically, peeling, chopping, and searing. This morning, it's the onions, red, pungent, and unforgiving. As I dice them into translucent cubes for his omelet, the sulfuric acid rises, stinging my eyes. I don't cry because I'm sad. I cry because the onions demand it. It is the only time I am allowed to shed tears in this house. By the time Malcolm descends the stairs, looking every bit the Ivy League titan he believes himself to be, I have already vanished the mess. I have scrubbed the counters, hidden the scraps, and set the table with the precision of a surgical theater. But I cannot scrub away the scent. It's etched into the whorls of my fingerprints, a permanent souvenir of my labor. Good morning, Malcolm. I say, my voice a soft, neutral tether to a reality he barely tolerates. He doesn't look at me. He looks at his phone, his thumb flicking through emails with a predatory rhythm. He sits, and I place the plate before him. You've been at the onions again, he says, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth he reserves for his clients. He hasn't even tasted the food. He just smells me. It's 7 a.m., Alicia. Why does this entire wing of the apartment reek like a roadside diner in the Midwest? I wanted the flavor to be right. I reply, keeping my hands behind my back, hiding the evidence of my service. Flavor is for people who have nothing else to offer, he snaps, finally looking up. His eyes, once the home of my greatest comfort, are now two cold marbles of judgment. You're like a walking reminder of everything I've tried to leave behind. That scent, it's the reek of service. It's the smell of a woman who doesn't understand that we aren't in that drafty farmhouse anymore. You're a shadow, Alicia. A shadow of the uneducated girl I dragged out of the dirt. And frankly, the dirt is starting to show again. He pushes the plate away, barely touched. The eggs I spent 20 minutes perfecting are now just cold proteins on an expensive ceramic disc. He stands, adjusting his tailor charcoal suit, a suit I spent an hour steaming until my fingers were red from the heat. He walks to the mirror in the foyer, preening. I follow him, not because I want to, but because it is my job to be the final check. I see it then, a microscopic crease, no longer than a fingernail, near the lapel of his tie. It's a ghost of a fold, invisible to anyone not looking for a reason to be angry. Malcolm catches my gaze in the mirror. His face contorts. It's not a slow burn, it's a flash fire. Look at this, he whispers, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. He points at the tie. Look at this mess. I have a meeting with the Aradhana Global reps today. Do you have any idea what this says about me? It says I am married to a woman who can't even handle a silk knot. It says my home life is as disorganized as a bargain bin. Malcolm, it's barely visible. It is visible to me, he roars, turning around. The sheer volume of his voice vibrates in my chest. You are a kitchen-dwelling anchor, Alicia. Do you understand that? While I am trying to ascend, while I am clawing my way to the top of the corporate ladder, you are down there, gripping my ankles with your onion-scented hands, trying to pull me back down to your level of mediocrity. He rips the tie off his neck with a violent jerk, the silk screaming as it's pulled through the collar. He throws it at my feet. It lands on the polished hardwood like a dead snake. I am an uneducated wife to you now, am I? I think, but the words stay locked behind my teeth. I have learned that words are just weapons he knows how to parry. Silence is my only armor. "Go get me another one," he commands, his breathing heavy. "And for God's sake, wash your hands. I can smell the poverty on you from here." I turn and walk back toward the bedroom. As I climb the stairs, I don't feel the sting of his insults as I used to. I don't feel the desperate urge to apologize, to beg for a scrap of his approval. Instead, I feel a cold, sharp clarity. It's the feeling of a mathematician looking at a failing equation. 10 years, 3,650 mornings of 4 a.m. wake-ups, thousands of shirts pressed, an entire identity erased, so he could be the man the world admires. I sold my heritage, my family's land, to pay for the very degree he uses to call me stupid. I am the crumbling foundation of this decade-long marriage, but he forgets one thing about foundations. When they decide to shift, the entire house comes down. I reach into the closet and pull out a deep navy tie, the one I bought him with the secret dividends from my private accounts. He thinks it was a gift from a headhunter. I run my thumb over the silk. In my mind, I am starting a tally. Malcolm thinks he is the one with the power because he has the title and the suit. He doesn't realize that I am the one who owns the building he works in. He doesn't know that every genius move he's made in the last 3 years was a ghost-written strategy, one left on his desk. I walk back down and hand him the tie. My face is a mask of perfect, submissive serenity. "Here you go, Malcolm," I say quietly. He snatches it, not even looking at me as he winds it around his neck. "Try to do something with yourself today, Alicia. Go to a spa. Get the smell of the kitchen out of your pores. You're an embarrassment to the image I'm trying to project." He grabs his briefcase and marches out the door without a backward glance. The heavy oak door thuds shut, the sound echoing through the empty, sterile apartment. I stand there for a moment, listening to the silence. Then, I walk back into the kitchen. I look at the cold eggs and the discarded onions. I pick up a piece of the diced onion and press it between my fingers until the juice runs clear. The smell is sharp, biting and real. I reach into the pocket of my apron and pull out my phone. I send a single message to Albert. "The foundation is ready to move. See you at the gala tonight. I am Alicia. And today, I am calculating exactly how much of my love for Malcolm remains. The math is simple, really. When you subtract respect, subtract gratitude, and subtract humanity, the result is 0. The scent of onions might be the smell of service to him, but to me, it's the smell of the earth, and the earth always wins in the end. The master suite of our Manhattan penthouse was a sanctuary of glass and cold marble, a place where the air always felt thin, as if the altitude had sucked the oxygen out of our marriage. Tonight was the Global Horizon Gala, the pinnacle of the social calendar, and the room was filled with the frantic, predatory energy of Malcolm's ambition. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a dark silhouette against the city lights, adjusting the cufflinks I had polished until my vision blurred. I stood behind him, holding a garment bag that felt like a lead weight in my hands. Inside was the dress he had chosen for me, a plain, shapeless, off-the-rack navy shift that cost less than the silk handkerchief in his pocket. "Put it on," Malcolm commanded without looking back, his voice a dry rasp of authority. He was a man obsessed with the brand, and tonight I was being rebranded as the background noise. I pulled the dress from the bag. The fabric felt cheap, synthetic, and scratchy against my skin. It was a dress designed to make a woman disappear, to turn her into a blurred figure in the corner of a photograph. "Malcolm, this isn't a gala dress. It's barely a cocktail dress. Everyone else will be in couture. Nancy is wearing that custom Dior we saw in the magazine." He turned then, his eyes raking over me with a clinical coldness that made me feel naked in the worst possible way. "Exactly, Alicia. Nancy has the pedigree to carry couture. She has the presence of a woman who was born for this. You." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out not to caress me, but to grab my wrist, turning it toward the harsh vanity lights. "Look at your skin. It's weathered. It's sun-damaged. No matter how much expensive cream I buy you, you still look like you just walked off a cornfield in Nebraska." The comparison hit like a verbal dagger, aimed with the precision of a man who knew exactly where the scar tissue was thinnest. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and the metallic tang of arrogance. Nancy has a porcelain glow. She's elegant. She's an asset. You, on the other hand, are a garbage investment. I've poured 10 years into refining you, and yet you still have the soul of a peasant. Tonight, I need you to be invisible so you don't distract Albert and the other investors from the real business at hand. You are a waste of my social capital, Alicia. A liability I have to hide. I felt the frozen tears prickling at the back of my throat, but I refused to let them fall. To cry was to give him the satisfaction of knowing he could still draw blood. Instead, I looked at my hands, the hands he called weathered. My mind was suddenly pulled back, thousands of miles away, to the golden dust of the Midwest. I could smell the parched earth of my family's ancestral farmland, the soil that had been in the Miller name for 4 generations. I remember the day I sat in that cramped lawyer's office in Lincoln, the scent of old paper and stale coffee thick in the air. I remembered the way my hand shook as I signed the deed over to a faceless developer. It was the sacrifice of the soil, the literal ground beneath my feet sold off, so that Malcolm could have his Ivy League dream. I had told him the money came from a mysterious benefactor, a distant relative's trust that had finally matured. I had invented a lie to protect his fragile ego, to let him believe the world recognized his genius enough to fund it. He didn't know that every tuition payment, every textbook, every tailored suit he wore during those 2 years was paid for with the dust of my father's legacy. He thought he was a self-made titan. He didn't realize he was a building constructed on a lot I had cleared with my own blood. Are you listening to me? Malcolm snapped, snapping his fingers in front of my face. Or is that simple brain of yours stuck on a loop again? I'm listening, Malcolm, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. I began to zip up the cheap navy dress. The zipper snagged on the fabric, an intentional flaw in a garment meant for someone who didn't matter. Good. Don't speak unless someone addresses you directly. And for God's sake, keep those hands hidden. I don't want Albert wondering why my wife has the hands of a farmhand, he said, turning back to the mirror to admire his own reflection. He looked at the bleeding crease of his suit, the perfect line I had spent an hour ensuring was sharp enough to cut. He saw a man of power. I saw a parasite who had forgotten the host he was feeding on. As I brushed my hair, I caught my own reflection in the corner of the mirror. The dress was a tragedy, a navy shroud for the woman I used to be. But behind the weathered skin and the simple eyes he mocked, there was a heat he couldn't see. The garbage investment was about to reach its maturity date. He had called me a liability. He had called me a waste of capital. He had forgotten the basic rules of the market. You never truly know the value of an asset until the owner decides to sell. And tonight, at the Global Horizon Gala, the owner was going public. I walked to the vanity and picked up a small, unassuming clutch. Inside was my phone, currently buzzing with a notification from the Aravna Global security feed. I saw Albert's motorcade pulling up to the hotel. I saw Nancy, already in the lobby, preening in her Dior, unaware that she was just another piece of stage dressing in the drama I had written. Let's go, Malcolm said, grabbing his coat. He didn't offer me his arm. He simply walked toward the door, expecting me to trail behind him like a shadow. Coming, Malcolm, I whispered to the empty room. I took one last look at the penthouse, the monument to my silence. The soil of the Midwest was long gone, sold to build this glass cage. But the strength of that soil was still in my bones. You can bury a seed in the dirt and step on it all you want, but eventually the ground will crack. And when it does, it doesn't matter how expensive the marble is. It's all going to break. I followed him out into the hallway, the cheap fabric of my dress swishing with a sound like a dry wind through cornstalks. Tonight, I wasn't just Alicia the dropout. I was the architect of his ruin, and the blueprints were finally ready for the reveal. The penthouse living room, a space I had meticulously curated to be a sanctuary of mid-century modern elegance, felt like a cold, glass-walled arena that afternoon. The silence was broken not by a gentle breeze from the terrace, but by the rhythmic, aggressive clicking of stiletto heels against the white Italian marble. Tuck! 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 It was the sound of an invasion. Malcolm had called ahead, his voice clipped and transactional, stating he was bringing Nancy by to pick up the Q4 projection files. He didn't ask if it was convenient. He simply informed me of her arrival as one might inform a concierge of a pending delivery. When the door opened, the contrast was a cruel, visceral blow. I was wearing my at-home attire, a faded linen apron over a simple cotton dress, my hair pulled back in a practical, uninspired bun. My hand still carried the faint, earthy sting of a turmeric I had used for Malcolm's wellness lunch. Nancy, however, stepped into my home as if she were stepping onto a stage. She was draped in a tailored charcoal blazer that screamed executive power, her hair a sheet of perfectly highlighted silk, and her perfume, a sharp, sophisticated blend of bergamot and leather, instantly suffocating the domestic sense of my kitchen. "Nancy, thank you for coming on such short notice," Malcolm said, his voice dropping into a register of warmth and respect that I hadn't heard in years. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, his eyes fixed on the continental intellect he so clearly admired. "Of course, Malcolm. The Albert account won't wait for anyone," Nancy replied, her smile bright and rehearsed. She spared me a glance, a look of polite, distant pity, the way one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that was slightly out of place. "Hello, Alicia. It's nice to see you in your element." "Alicia, don't just stand there like a decorative gargoyle that's lost its purpose," Malcolm snapped, finally acknowledging my presence only to diminish it. "Make some coffee, the Blue Mountain blend, and use the V60. Nancy appreciates a proper extraction. None of that instant, swill you usually drink." I turned toward the kitchen, my heart thumping a heavy, irregular rhythm against my ribs. As I weighed the beans and boiled the water, their voices drifted into the kitchen, a symphony of pseudo-intellectualism and corporate vanity. Malcolm was explaining a market entry strategy, a strategy that I had drafted on a yellow legal pad 2 nights ago while he was snoring, yet he presented it with the bravado of a lone conqueror. "The way you've pivoted the Aravna global portfolio is nothing short of brilliant, Malcolm," Nancy gushed. I could hear the clink of her expensive jewelry as she gestured. "The logic is so surgical. It's about seeing the patterns others are too slow to notice," Malcolm replied, his ego expanding to fill the room. I walked back into the living room, carrying the tray with the precision I had practiced for a decade. As I set the delicate porcelain cups down, Nancy turned to me, perhaps out of a sense of performative kindness. "Alicia, Malcolm was just telling me about the regional expansion. Given your unique background in the Midwest, do you think the rural demographics will respond to this kind of high-tier branding?" The air in the room seemed to vanish. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer the nuanced demographic analysis I had actually written into the plan, but Malcolm cut me off with a laugh that felt like a splash of ice water. Nancy, he said, shaking his head with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "You're far too generous. Don't bother asking her opinion. My dear Alicia only knows how to tell a frying pan from a pot. In her world, strategy is deciding whether to use salted or unsalted butter." Nancy let out a soft, tinkling laugh, a sound that joined Malcolm's in a harmony of derision. "Oh, Malcolm, you're terrible. I'm just being a realist," Malcolm continued, leaning back into the sofa I had paid for with my secret dividends. "You can't ask a bird that's spent its whole life in a cage about the mechanics of flight. She's a wonderful houseminder, aren't you, War? I mean, Alicia. But let's leave the continental intellect to the people with the degrees, shall we?" I stood there, the empty tray clutched against my chest like a shield, watching him. I watched the way he looked at Nancy, the way he leaned in when she spoke, the way his eyes tracked the movement of her hands. It was the look he used to give me 10 years ago, back when he was a broke student and I was the brilliant girl who believed in him. Now, he was using the very stairs I had built for him to stand on so he could spit down at me. It was a thorn in the heart, a sharp, twisting pain that finally severed the last thread of my hesitation. I realized then that my erasure of dignity wasn't a side effect of his success, it was the goal. He needed me to be small, so he could feel gargantuan. He needed the mirror of comparison with women like Nancy to remind himself that he had upgraded. "Is there anything else, Malcolm?" I asked, my voice as flat and sterile as a hospital corridor. "No, that'll be all, Alicia," he said, already turning his back to me to point at a chart on his tablet. "Go check on dinner. I don't want the roast to be as dry as your conversation." I walked back to the kitchen, every step a deliberate act of will. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I pulled out my phone. My hands, which he claimed only knew pots and pans, moved with a lethal digital grace. I sent a message to Albert's private secretary. "Regarding the Aradhana Global Gala tonight, ensure Nancy is seated next to Malcolm. I want him to feel as comfortable as possible before the floor falls out." I looked at the frying pan on the stove. Malcolm was right about one thing. I didn't know how to use it, but he forgot that a pan is just a tool. In the right hands, it can create a feast, or it can be the very thing that delivers the heat that burns the whole house down. I am Alicia, and I am done being the mirror he uses to admire a reflection that doesn't actually belong to him. The continental intellect he so admires is about to meet the woman who actually owns the continent. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a cathedral of vanity, a sprawling expanse of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the sort of suffocating opulence that makes the soul feel anemic. As we stepped through the heavy oak doors, the air hit me like a physical weight. A cocktail of expensive oud, French champagne, and the metallic tang of cold, hard ambition. The Global Horizon Gala was a Shark Tank in black tie attire, and tonight, Malcolm was ready to swim with the predators. Malcolm's grip on my arm was not a gesture of affection, it was a restraint. He held me with the clinical detachment of a man carrying a piece of luggage he intended to check in and forget. His eyes were already scanning the room, darting toward the circle of titans near the stage where the air was thickest with power. "Stay close, and for God's sake, don't look at the chandeliers like a tourist," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the swelling crescendo of the string quartet. I smoothed the front of my off-the-rack navy dress, the synthetic shroud he'd chosen to ensure I remained a non-entity. I felt like a bruise on a silk sheet, a dark, unsightly smudge in a room filled with light. Then I saw her. Nancy was already there, positioned like a centerpiece near the VIP lounge. She was draped in crimson Dior, her skin glowing with that porcelain radiance Malcolm had weaponized against me earlier that evening. When she saw us, she didn't wave. She tilted her head with a triumphant, feline grace. Malcolm's pace quickened, but not toward the bar or the lounge. He flagged down a young busboy who looked barely old enough to shave. "Table 99, Malcolm said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm tone he used when he was executing a social execution. "Take my associate there. She'll be dining alone this evening." The busboy blinked, confused. "Sir, table 99 is in the service corridor." "It's for—" "I know exactly where it is." Malcolm cut him off, finally letting go of my arm with a sharp, dismissive shove. He didn't look at me. He looked at Nancy, who was now gliding toward him. "Alicia, I have business to conduct. Albert is expecting a certain caliber of presentation. Your presence at the head table would be a distraction we can't afford. Go, eat, stay out of the light." And just like that, I was the discarded shadow. The busboy led the way, and I followed him past the sea of tables. We walked past table 5, where the governor sat, past table 12, where the tech moguls laughed over glasses of 1945 Bordeaux. The further we walked, the dimmer the lights became. We moved past the velvet ropes, past the floral arrangements that cost more than my family's old tractor, and toward the back of the hall. Table 99 wasn't just in the back. It was an insult rendered in furniture. It was a small, wobbly wooden table tucked into a dark corner, mere inches away from the swinging doors of the kitchen. The scent of bleach and old lobster shells drifted from the service entrance, and the constant thud-thud of the trash bins being empty provided a rhythmic reminder of where I sat in Malcolm's social caste. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the busboy whispered, looking genuinely pained as he pulled out a chair that creaked under the slightest pressure. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I said, sitting down. The math is exactly right. From this vantage point, in the corner of shadows, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage and the head table. I watched Malcolm take his seat, not at the back, but right next to Albert, the billionaire whose signature could make or break a man's life. Nancy was on Malcolm's other side, her red dress a bright, bleeding heart in the center of the room. I watched Malcolm perform. He was brilliant. I had to give him that. He leaned in, his gestures wide and confident, his face a mask of practiced charisma. He was building his empire right there, laughing with the elite, clinking glasses with the gods of finance. He looked like he belonged there. He looked like he had earned every bit of it. But from the dark, I could see the truth. I could see the way he adjusted his cufflinks, the ones I had polished. I could see the way he used the regional expansion talking points, the ones I had written. He was a man standing on a mountain made of my bones, and he was currently using his height to spit on the very person who had lifted him there. Then it started. The laughter that pierces the ears. Malcolm said something to Albert, gesturing toward the back of the room, toward me. Albert looked, his eyes squinting into the darkness. Malcolm let out a sharp, barking laugh, followed by Nancy's tinkling, crystalline giggle. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel the heat of their mockery. I didn't need to hear the words to know they were about the simple dropout he'd stowed away in the pantry. Their laughter wasn't just a sound. It was a physical assault, a series of sharp needles intended to remind me that I was nothing. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the vibration of the kitchen doors against my back. I was absolute isolation amidst luxury, a ghost at the feast I had paid for. But as the laughter reached its peak, I felt something shift inside me. The wasted devotion of the last decade didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like fuel. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen's glow was the only light in my corner. I looked at the guest list on the Aravna Global Internal Portal. I saw the seating chart I had suggested to Albert weeks ago. Malcolm thought he had exiled me to the trash bins to hide his shame. He didn't realize that in a room full of predators, the one who sits in the dark sees the most. "Enjoy the view from the top, Malcolm," I whispered, my voice drowned out by the clatter of a waiter dropping a tray of silverware nearby. Because the higher you climb, the harder the ground feels when it stops being a foundation and starts being a grave. I watched Albert stand up. He looked around the room, his expression unreadable, searching for something, or someone. Malcolm stood up too, puffing out his chest, ready to be the center of Albert's world. I checked the time. 9:15 p.m. The final stage of the plan was no longer a plan, it was a countdown. I stood up from my wobbly chair, ignoring the social caste that told me to stay in the dark. I didn't walk back toward the light. I walked toward the kitchen doors. I had one more thing to check before the high school dropout became the most important person in the room. The reek of the trash bins didn't bother me anymore. It was just the smell of a world that needed to be cleaned out, and I was the only one with the broom. Sitting in the darkness of table 99, the heavy scent of industrial-grade floor cleaner from the kitchen stinging my nose, I closed my eyes. The distant, crystalline laughter of the elite felt like a dull ache in my temples, but beneath it, a deeper, older pain began to stir. It was the weight of the golden secret I had carried for a decade, a burden that was finally beginning to crush the very man I had intended to protect. My mind drifted back 10 years, away from the glass towers of Manhattan to a sprawling estate in the rainy outskirts of Chicago. My father, Thomas Aravna, the founding titan of Aravna Global, lay in a bed that looked far too large for his shrinking frame. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, but in his final moments, his only concern was the girl who would inherit it all. "Alicia!" he had whispered, his hand trembling as he gripped mine. The smell of rain and expensive cedarwood filled the room. Gold is a magnet for vultures, but love is the anchor for the soul. Promise me you won't let them see the light until you know they won't try to steal it. Find a man who loves the woman, not the bank account. Hide your brilliance, Duck. Be the charcoal until you find someone who sees the diamond." It was a fatal masquerade born from a father's dying wish. I took that promise like a sacred vow. When he passed, I became the high school dropout. I simplified my speech, traded my couture for cotton, and hid my Ivy League acumen behind a mask of domestic docility. I wanted to be loved for the parts of me that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Then came Malcolm. At 24, he was beautiful, hungry, and seemingly sincere. He was a struggling analyst with a fire in his eyes that I mistook for passion. I thought he was the one who had passed the test. I thought he loved the Alicia who made him grilled cheese sandwiches and listened to his dreams of conquering Wall Street. I didn't realize that I was nurturing misplaced love, or that Malcolm didn't want a partner. He wanted a pedestal. For 10 years, our marriage was a play where I was the stagehand and he was the star. But while Malcolm slept, the simple wife he mocked was running the world. Every night, after the lights were out and Malcolm's snores signaled his retreat into a dream world where he was a king, I would slip out of bed. I didn't go to a study or a home office. That would have been too risky. Instead, I went to the pantry. Between the industrial-sized bags of flour and the stacks of canned tomatoes, I kept my golden secret, an encrypted, military-grade laptop hidden inside a hollowed-out box of old cookbooks. In the blue light of that screen, the simpleton vanished. I was the silent architect of Aravna Global. I remembered the night Malcolm nearly lost everything. He had walked into the apartment, pale and shaking, because he had botched a $3 billion merger. He sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, weeping about how his career was over. I had stroked his hair, playing the role of the comforting, dim-witted wife, saying, "Oh, Malcolm, maybe you just need to look at it differently." That night, in the pantry, I worked until 4 a.m. I diverted funds through shell companies I controlled, restructured the debt using algorithms I had spent years perfecting, and sent an anonymous insider tip to his boss. The next morning, Malcolm was hailed as a genius. He came home and threw his briefcase on the floor, shouting about his brilliant pivot. He didn't even thank me for the tea I made him. He just told me I wouldn't understand the complexities of high-stakes finance. I had funded his entire life with a sacrifice of the soil, the money from my father's estate that I funneled through mysterious benefactors and scholarship funds. Every tailored suit, every Rolex, every ounce of confidence he used to belittle me was a gift from the very woman he called trash. I had stayed in the shadows because I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was being the foundation my father talked about. But standing on a foundation is different from trampling it. Malcolm hadn't just used my strength. He had tried to erase my humanity to feel superior. He had turned my father's test into my own personal prison. Now, back in the darkness of the Ritz-Carlton, I opened my eyes. I looked at the architect in the mirror of my phone. The grief for my father was still there, but it was being replaced by a cold, surgical resolve. My father told me to find a man who loved the woman. I hadn't found him. I had found a parasite who mistook my silence for emptiness. The fatal masquerade was over. The charcoal was tired of being stepped on. It was time to show Malcolm that when you burn charcoal long enough, it doesn't just turn into ash, it becomes the fire that levels the house. I saw Albert, the man I had handpicked to be my public face, standing near the stage. He caught my eye in the shadows. He knew. He was the only one who knew that the woman at table 99 owned every single chair in this room. "It's time, Dad," I whispered into the dark. "The test is over." And Malcolm, he failed with honors. I stood up from the wobbly table. The weight of the secret was gone, replaced by the weight of a crown I was finally ready to wear in the light. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted with the sudden, tectonic force of a mountain rising from the sea. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and a hush fell over the room that was more deafening than the orchestral crescendo that had preceded it. Albert, the legendary lead investor and the man whose shadow loomed over every financial district from New York to Hong Kong, stepped into the light. He didn't just walk. He commanded the very molecules of the air he breathed. Every titan, every shark, and every socialite in the room instinctively straightened their spines, their eyes gleaming with a mixture of reverence and primal hunger. I watched from the suffocating darkness of table 99 as Malcolm transformed. It was a grotesque metamorphosis. The The man who had spent the last decade treating me like a stray dog suddenly became a lapdog himself. He straightened his charcoal suit with trembling fingers, wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip with a silk handkerchief, and donned a smile so sycophantic it made my stomach churn. Beside him, Nancy smoothed her crimson Dior, her eyes fixed on Albert with the calculated precision of a predator sensing its next great meal. They were two parasites preparing to feast, oblivious to the fact that the host they were looking for was sitting in the shadows of the trash bins. I decided I couldn't stay in that corner any longer. The air near the service entrance was thick with the smell of discarded grease and the cold, metallic scent of my own isolation. I needed to move, to breathe, to find a sliver of the Alicia that existed before the masquerade began. As I stood and navigated the narrow service path, a young waiter, his face a mask of frantic exhaustion, came charging through the kitchen doors with a tray of steaming roasted onion bisque, a specialty of a house that I had personally approved months ago during a secret menu tasting. He didn't see me. I didn't have time to move. The collision was violent. The tray hit my shoulder with a sickening thud, and the world tilted. I felt the scalding heat of the soup before I felt the floor. It drenched the synthetic fabric of my navy dress, soaking through to my skin, a searing, liquid fire that made me gasp in pain. I hit the marble floor hard, my palms skidding through the shards of shattered porcelain. I was a heap of soaked fabric and bruised dignity, splayed out directly in the path where Albert and his entourage were walking. The silence that followed was absolute. The orchestra stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. Hundreds of eyes, the coldest eyes in the world, were suddenly trained on me. I was the stain on the silk, the glitch in the matrix of their perfect evening. I looked up, blinking through the stinging soup that dripped from my hair, and saw Malcolm. For a heartbeat, a dying spark of hope flickered in the deepest cellar of my heart. I thought, perhaps, that after 10 years, after the Midwest soil and the Ivy League tuition and the 1,000 shirts I had pressed, he would see his wife bleeding on the floor and offer a hand. I thought the man I had built might finally show a shred of the humanity I had sacrificed everything to preserve. But hope is a dangerous thing in the hands of a narcissist. It only provides them with a clearer target. Malcolm didn't reach down to help me. He didn't even look at me with concern. Instead, he stepped forward, his face contorting into a mask of such pure, unadulterated hatred that it felt more painful than the scalding soup on my skin. He looked down at me, and I saw the spit of hatred gleaming in his eyes. He wasn't worried about my burns. He was worried about his brand. "You!" Malcolm bellowed, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap of bile. "What have you done, you clumsy, useless cow?" He didn't care that I was hurt. He didn't care that my skin was turning a raw, angry red beneath the soup. He only saw the public humiliation I had supposedly brought upon him. He turned to Albert, who had stopped just feet away, his face unreadable. Malcolm's voice dropped into a desperate, frantic pitch, a man trying to scrape the mud off his own polished shoes by using my body as a rug. "Mr. Albert, I am so incredibly sorry," Malcolm stammered, his hands shaking as he gestured toward my crumpled form. "Please, do not dirty your shoes on this mess. This woman, she's a mental burden I've been forced to carry. She's my wife, unfortunately, but she's been highly unstable lately. She's an embarrassment to the firm, a complete liability I thought I could keep contained in the shadows where she belongs." Nancy stepped up behind him, her hand touching his arm in a show of false solidarity, her eyes glinting with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. "It's true, Albert," she whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. "Malcolm has been so brave, dealing with her conditions while running the account. It's a tragedy, really. She's just not of our world." The words felt like physical blows, a rhythmic stoning of my soul in the center of a cathedral of lies. A mental burden, an embarrassment. He was rewriting our entire history in front of the people he worshipped, painting me as a lunatic to justify his own cruelty. He was standing on the stage of lies he had built with my money, using the very height I gave him to kick me while I was down. "Look at you!" Malcolm hissed, leaning down so only I could see the true darkness in his pupils. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a hollowed-out shell of ambition. You've ruined everything. All my hard work, all my networking, and you come out here and make a scene like the common farmhand you are. You're trash, Alicia. You're the dirt I tried to wash off my life. He stood up and pointed toward the service corridor, his voice rising again for the benefit of the crowd. Get up. Crawl out the back door, Alicia. Go back to the kitchen where you belong. Don't you dare show your face in the light again tonight. You're done. I'm done with you. A ripple of hushed judgment moved through the crowd. I heard the whispers. Poor Malcolm. How could she be so careless? I heard she didn't even finish high school. Each word was a nail in the coffin of my devotion. Every second I spent on that cold marble floor, I felt the last lingering threads of my love for Malcolm snap. The heat of the soup on my skin was nothing compared to the ice that was forming in my veins. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I looked up at Albert, who was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver through the room. Malcolm thought Albert was disgusted with me. He was too blinded by his own arrogance to realize that Albert was a man who hated nothing more than a man who couldn't command his own house. I wiped a smear of onion bisque from my cheek with a movement that was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the instability Malcolm had just diagnosed. I stood up. My knees were raw, and my navy dress was ruined, but I stood with a spine made of the very iron I had used to forge Aradna Global. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't look at Nancy. I looked at Malcolm, and for the first time in 10 years, I let him see the predator behind the prey. You're right about one thing, Malcolm, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the ballroom like a diamond on glass. The dirt is showing, but it's not on my dress. It's in your soul. Malcolm's face twisted in rage, and he raised his hand as if to strike me, to silence the dropout who dared to speak back. But before his hand could descend, Albert moved. He didn't move toward Malcolm. He moved toward me. The stage was set. The poison had been spilled, but it wasn't going to kill me. It was going to provide the perfect, toxic environment for the end of Malcolm's world. The stage of lies was about to be burned down, and I was the one holding the match. Malcolm, Albert said, his voice a low rumble that silenced the room instantly. I think you've said quite enough. I took a deep breath, the scent of the soup, my soup, filling my lungs. The simple wife was gone. The high school dropout was dead, and in her place stood the woman who was about to show Malcolm exactly what happens when you tell the owner of the world to crawl out the back door. The suffocating silence that followed Malcolm's roar was unlike any I had ever heard. It wasn't the silence of a pause or a lull in conversation. It was the vacuum that remains after a bomb has detonated, leaving only the ringing in one's ears and the metallic taste of fear. The grand ballroom, once a cathedral of light, felt suddenly like a morgue. Hundreds of New York's most powerful people, men who moved markets with a whisper and women who could end reputations with a glance, stood frozen, their glasses suspended halfway to their lips. Every gaze was a cold, sharp needle, and they were all aimed at me. Malcolm stood over me, his chest heaving under his tailored charcoal suit. The man I had spent 10 years building, the man whose Ivy League degree I had paid for with the dust of my father's Midwestern farmland, looked down at me with a height of arrogance so towering it felt like it might touch the chandeliers. He turned to Albert, let out a hollow, nervous laugh that rattled like dry bones, and gestured toward me with a hand that shook with suppressed rage. "Forgive her, sir," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with a faux apologetic sweetness that felt like syrup over a razor blade. "Please, don't dirty your hands. She's just a simple high school dropout. I made the mistake of bringing her, thinking she could handle one night in the light. But as you can see, you can take the girl out of the dirt, but you can't take the dirt out of the girl." The laughter that followed his statement wasn't a roar. It was a scattered, cruel tittering from Nancy and a few other sycophants who lived for the blood of social execution. Nancy's crimson Dior shimmered under the lights as she tilted her head, her porcelain skin glowing with the malicious satisfaction of a predator watching its prey finally stop twitching. I felt the soup, the roasted onion bisque I had personally perfected months ago, cooling on my skin. It felt like a heavy, liquid shame. For a moment, I stayed on my knees. I felt the verbal blades of Malcolm's disdain cutting into the deepest cellar of my heart. I remember the nights I sat in the pantry on an encrypted laptop, making the billion-dollar moves that kept his genius projects afloat while he snored in our Egyptian cotton sheets. I remembered the sacrifice of the soil, the legacy of my father, Thomas Aradna, which I had traded for this man's ego. And then, something in me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a decade. The breaking point hadn't come from the physical fall or the hot soup. It came from the realization that Malcolm didn't just want me small, he wanted me erased. He wanted me to be a ghost in my own empire. I stood up. I didn't scramble. I didn't rush. I rose with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. My navy dress was soaked, and my palms were red from the marble, but as I stood to my full height, the peasant persona he had tried to force on me evaporated like mist in a furnace. I reached up and wiped a smear of soup from my cheek with a single, elegant motion of my thumb. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't look at Nancy's smirk. I looked directly into Albert's eyes. The man who was the only one in this room who knew the high school dropout was actually the woman who signed his checks. A high school dropout, I repeated. My voice was quiet, but it had the weight of a diamond-tipped drill. It sliced through Malcolm's nervous laughter like a surgical scalpel. Is that what I am to you tonight, Malcolm? A liability to be managed? A mental burden to be discarded near the trash bins? Malcolm's face contorted. He stepped toward me, his hand reaching out not to help, but to grab my arm and drag me back into the shadows. Shut up, Alicia. You've done enough damage. Go home. Now. I didn't move. I looked at his hand as if it were a particularly repulsive insect. You talk about dirt, Malcolm. You talk about the Midwest as if it's a stain you can't wash off. You've spent 10 years building a stage of lies, preening in suits I bought and reciting strategies I wrote, all while telling the world I'm the one who can't keep up. You're delusional, Malcolm hissed, his eyes darting to Albert, his desperation starting to leak through the cracks of his composure. See, sir? I told you. She's unstable. The lack of education, it leads to these kinds of outbursts. I turned my gaze to Nancy. And you, Nancy. You like the crimson Dior. It suits you. It matches the blood of the people you think you've climbed over to get here. You both look at me and see a simpleton because that's what makes you feel gargantuan. But you've forgotten the most basic rule of the market. An asset's value isn't determined by the person who's trying to sell it for parts. It's determined by the owner. I looked back at Malcolm. The verbal blades were now in my hands. You call me uneducated because I didn't sit in the classrooms you did. But while you were learning how to recite theories, I was learning how to build them. While you were sleeping, I was the architect of the very miracles that saved your career. You didn't marry a simpleton, Malcolm. You married the very person who made you a man. And then you spent 10 years trying to kill her so you wouldn't have to say thank you. Malcolm's nervous laughter had died. He was pale, the sweat on his forehead glistening under the chandeliers. He looked at Albert, expecting the Titan to step in and crush the hysterical woman. He expected the world to stay in the order he had prescribed. But the world was shifting. Albert, I said, my voice now loud enough to reach the back of the hall where table 99 sat in the dark. Is the simpleton authorized to speak, or should I crawl out the back door as my husband suggested? Albert didn't blink. He didn't look at Malcolm's pleading face. He stepped forward, his expression changing from clinical detachment to a profound, terrifying respect. He looked at me, not at the soaked dress or the soup stains, but at the woman who had founded Aravna Global. The room is yours, madam, Albert said. The silence that followed wasn't just suffocating, it was absolute. I saw Malcolm's knees buckle slightly. I saw Nancy's wine glass tilt, the dark red liquid spilling onto her crimson dress like a fresh wound. The breaking point was over. The dismantling had begun. I looked at the high school dropout reflection in the polished marble at my feet. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who had spent 10 years as the foundation of a house that didn't deserve her. The air in the ballroom didn't just grow cold, it became a vacuum, a hollow space where the sound of the string quartet had died, and the only thing remaining was the rhythmic, frantic thud of Malcolm's heart. He stood there, a man whose entire existence was built on the collapse of a false throne, his face a mask of pale, shivering terror. He looked at Albert, his investor god, waiting for the lightning bolt to strike me down. He expected a dismissal, a security escort, a final erasure of the simple dropout who had dared to stand up. But Albert didn't even look at Malcolm. To Albert, Malcolm had become as insignificant as the shards of the soup bowl on the floor. Instead, Albert took a single, deliberate step toward me. Then, in a movement that felt like the world tilting on its axis, he dropped. The sound of his knee hitting the polished marble echoed through the cathedral-like space with the finality of a gavel. It was a painful bow, a physical submission from the most powerful man in the room to the woman Malcolm had stowed away near the trash bins. "Madam Chairwoman," Albert's voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried to the furthest corners of the hall. "Forgive our insolence. I was not informed you would be attending tonight without your usual security detail." The silence that followed was absolute. Malcolm's world began to physically and mentally tilt. I watched his eyes, the eyes that had looked at me with such Ludocabensian spit of hatred, now dart wildly, searching for a reality that no longer existed. He was witnessing the collapse of a false throne in real time. Albert reached into his breast pocket and produced a slim, black leather folder, the Aradhana Global Annual Report, a document sealed with the gold crest that only a 90% shareholder had the right to break. He held it out to me with both hands, his head still bowed in a gesture of profound respect. "The quarterly audits you requested, madam," Albert said, "and the termination papers for the underperforming assets we discussed." I took the folder, the leather cool and smooth against my palms. I didn't look at it. I kept my eyes on Malcolm. He looked like a man who had just realized the benefactor he'd spent a decade searching for, the mysterious force that had funded his Ivy League MBA and quietly saved his failing projects, had been the very woman washing his socks and dicing his onions. "Albert," I said, my voice cutting through the shivering terror in the room like a surgical blade, "who is the majority shareholder of Aradhana Global?" "You are, madam," Albert replied, finally standing but remaining half a step behind me, as was the protocol. "You hold 90% of the voting stock. The rest is held in trust for your charitable foundations." Malcolm let out a sound, a choked, animalistic whimper. He looked at the folder, then at me, then back at Albert. No, that's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She's Alicia. She didn't even finish high school. She's uneducated. You're making a mistake." "The only mistake made in this room, Malcolm," I said, stepping closer until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, "was mine. I made the mistake of thinking a man's character could be built if I provided the foundation. I gave you the sacrifice of the soil, the legacy of my father, and you used it to buy a pair of shoes so you could stomp on my face." I saw Nancy in the background, her crimson Dior now looking like a shroud of shame. She began to back away, her porcelain glow replaced by a sickly gray as she realized she had been preening in a house owned by the woman she called a peasant. "The math of our marriage, Malcolm, has reached its final tally," I continued, my voice a cold, terrifying victory. "Every asset you think you own, this suit, that watch, the penthouse, the very air you're breathing in this ballroom, belongs to Aradhana Global. And Aradhana Global belongs to me." I opened the black folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't an audit. It was a legal strike. "This is a formal notice of asset reclamation," I said, handing the paper to him. "As of this moment, your accounts are frozen. Your access to all corporate properties is revoked. And your position as a rising star in this firm, consider it extinguished. You aren't just fired, Malcolm. You're being erased." Malcolm's knees buckled. He fell to the floor, not in a bow of respect like Albert, but in a heap of broken arrogance. He was a man who had been building an empire on my back, and I had finally decided to stand up. "Alicia, please," he gasped, reaching for the hem of my soaked navy dress with a hand that had once pointed at me in disdain. I didn't know. I can change. I pulled the fabric of my dress away from his touch, a final act of hygiene. You didn't know because you didn't look. You were too busy admiring your own reflection in the mirror I was holding for you. But the mirror is broken now, Malcolm. And so are you. I turned to Albert, the cold, terrifying victory settling in my bones. Albert, have security escort Mr. Malcolm out, and make sure he leaves his corporate-issued watch at the door. I don't want him taking another second of my time. As the security team moved in, the ballroom remained in that suffocating silence, a room of titans watching the most brutal execution they had ever witnessed. I stood there, the high school dropout, in a soup-stained dress, holding the folder that represented my father's legacy. The false throne had collapsed, and as the dust settled, I was the only one left standing. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just a pause. It was a vacuum, an absolute absence of sound that felt as though the very air had been drained from the Ritz-Carlton. This 10-chapter story outline, which I had begun developing on January 31st, 2026, was finally reaching its point of no return. I walked toward the stage, my footsteps echoing with a steady, percussive rhythm against the marble floors. Every step was a declaration of war, every breath a rehearsal for the end. I reached the podium and took the microphone from its stand, the cold metal feeling like an extension of my own resolve. I looked down at Malcolm, who remained on his knees, a crumpled figure in a charcoal suit that I had bought with my own secret dividends. Beside him, Nancy, the woman he had used as a mirror to reflect my supposed inadequacies, stood frozen, her crimson dress a vivid splash of shame against the pale walls. I adjusted the microphone, and when I spoke, my voice was as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill, cutting through the thick, stagnant atmosphere of the room. For 10 years, I have been told that I am a liability. I began, the sound of my voice amplified into a low, resonant rumble that shook the crystal chandeliers. I have been told that my education was insufficient, that my background was a stain, and that my value was equivalent to the kitchen tiles I scrubbed. Malcolm, you spent a decade teaching me that your success was your own, and that my presence was merely a charitable act on your part. I saw him flinch, his eyes darting toward the exits, but the security team, men who reported to me through Albert, blocked every path. This was the perfect reckoning, a bloodless execution that was a decade in the making. But tonight, the audit is complete. I continued, my voice gaining a lethal surgical edge. You spoke of investments, Malcolm. You spoke of assets. So, let us look at the books. The 5,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Central Park. It is held in a trust controlled entirely by Aradna Global. The vintage Porsche you drive, a corporate lease under my name. The offshore accounts, the rainy day funds, even the very shoes on your feet. All of it is the property of the woman you called a high school dropout. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd, a collective intake of breath from the very titans Malcolm had tried so hard to impress. I was dismantling his existence, piece by piece, with the lethal logic of a woman who had seen every hidden line of code in his life. You functioned on a stage I built for you, I said, leaning into the microphone, my gaze locked on his pale, sweating face. You recited lines I wrote. You took credit for miracles that I performed while you were sleeping. And yet, you used that very power to try and erase the person who gave it to you. That, Malcolm, is not just a character flaw. In the world of Aradna Global, it is a gross ethical violation. I pulled a document from the folder Albert had handed me, a formal termination notice, signed with the authority of a 90% shareholder. As of 9:45 p.m. tonight, your employment with every subsidiary of Aradna Global is terminated. You are being removed for cause, specifically for the systemic devaluation of corporate assets and the bridge burning of the company's most vital relationship. You are leaving this room with nothing, Malcolm. Not a penny, not a car, and certainly not the dignity you tried to steal from me. Malcolm began to beg, his voice a parrot, pathetic sound that barely carried to the stage. Alicia, please. We're family. We've been together for 10 years. You can't just throw me to the wolves. Think of what we had. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The poetic justice wasn't in his pain, it was in the absolute clarity of his defeat. "You're right, Malcolm. We've been together for 10 years, I replied, my voice softening but losing none of its bite. "And in those 10 years, I watched you become a man who couldn't see the person standing right in front of him. You called me uneducated. You told Albert I was a simpleton because you thought my lack of a degree meant a lack of a soul. I stepped away from the podium, standing at the very edge of the stage, looking down at the wreckage of his arrogance. I learned basic math in school, Malcolm, I said, the words falling into the silence like heavy stones into a dark lake. I learned how to add, how to multiply, and how to subtract. For a decade, I added to your life. I multiplied your successes, but tonight, I'm finally doing the final subtraction." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room, over Nancy, and over the man who had been my husband. "Today, your total in my life is 0. I dropped the microphone. The sound of it hitting the stage was a dull, final thud, the sound of a gavel closing a case. I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't wait for the security team to drag him toward the service entrance. I simply turned and walked toward the back of the stage, my head held high, the simpleton dead and the chairwoman, finally, irrevocably alive. The math of revenge was complete. It was a cold, precise equation that had resulted in the only possible answer, my freedom. The grand ballroom, once a theater of my own public execution, had transformed into the site of my bloody emancipation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the metallic tang of Malcolm's terror, but beneath it all, I smelled the crisp, cold promise of a winter dawn. Malcolm's cries had faded into a pathetic, rhythmic wail as the security team, men who moved with a clinical, lethal efficiency, dragged him across the marble floors. His fingers clawed at the air, his eyes bulging as he realized that the city he once thought he owned was now nothing more than a cage he had built for himself. He was being removed like a stain from a silk sheet, discarded into the night where his arrogance would no longer find an audience. I turned my gaze toward the VIP lounge, searching for the flash of crimson Dior that had haunted my evening. Nancy was gone. She had vanished into the shadows of a coat check, and the side exits the moment the high school dropout had begun her surgical dismantling of Malcolm's life. Like any true social predator, she had a keen instinct for a sinking ship, and she had abandoned Malcolm to save her own porcelain skin before the splash could ruin her dress. She was a coward draped in couture, a footnote in a story she thought she was co-authoring. I stood on that stage, elevated above the titans of industry and the gods of finance, and I felt the weight of the last 10 years finally lift from my shoulders. This was the return of the Queen, a moment of total liberation and reclaimed honor. I was no longer the kitchen-dwelling anchor, or the mental burden. I was a resurrected titan, standing on the ruins of a marriage that had tried to bury me alive. I looked at the faces in the crowd. Men who had looked at me with pity at table 99 were now looking at me with a reverence that was indistinguishable from fear. They finally understood that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing to prove and everything to lose. I signaled to Albert, who was standing at the foot of the stage like a sentinel of my new reality. He gestured to a waiter, who approached me with a tray holding a single, tall glass of vintage 1996 Krug. The bubbles danced in the light of the chandeliers, a shimmering, golden liquid that represented the decade of wealth I had hidden from the man who claimed to provide for me. I took the glass, the crystal feeling light and cold in my hand. Then, I looked down at my left hand, at the modest gold band that had been the anchor of my fatal masquerade. With a slow, deliberate movement, I slid the ring from my finger. It felt heavier than it looked, a circle of metal that had represented a decade of breaking the chains of my own brilliance to accommodate Malcolm's mediocrity. I held it over the glass, the gold glinting one last time, and then I let it go. Ting! The ring hit the bottom of the glass with a sharp, crystalline sound. I watched it sink through the bye, coming to rest at the base of the champagne, a relic of a dead life, a sacrifice to the dawn of a new era. I didn't drink. I simply set the glass down on the podium, leaving the ring to drown in the very luxury Malcolm had used to belittle me. It was a poetic justice, so pure it made the air taste like ozone. I walked off the stage, my head held high, the navy synthetic dress feeling like a jubba of iron. I didn't look at the crowd, and I didn't wait for their applause. I walked past the mahogany doors, past the security stations, and through the revolving glass doors of the Ritz-Carlton. The New York air hit my face, cold and sharp, smelling of wet asphalt in the sea. It was the first time in 10 years I had breathed without the permission of a man. The sun was just beginning to touch the tips of the skyscrapers, a sliver of gold breaking through the gray Manhattan skyline. I saw my motorcade waiting, a line of black SUVs that looked like shadows against the morning mist. Albert opened the door for me, his face a mask of quiet, profound respect. "Where to, Madam Chairwoman?" he asked. "Home, Albert," I said, my voice as steady as the foundation of the city. "But first, have the locks changed on the penthouse, and send a crew to pack Malcolm's things in trash bags. He can find them on the sidewalk outside his old high school. I want him to remember exactly where he started." As the SUV pulled away from the curb, I looked out the window. I saw a man standing under a streetlight a block away, his charcoal suit torn, and his face a mask of broken sanity. It was Malcolm. He was standing on a street corner he used to ignore, looking up at the glass towers as if searching for a window that would open for him. It wouldn't. He was a ghost in a city he no longer possessed, a man who had been subtracted until he reached zero. I leaned back into the leather seat, closing my eyes as the high school dropout just taught the world the most expensive lesson of the century. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never mistake a foundation for a rug. The simpleton was gone, but the Aravna legacy was finally, irrevocably, in the hands of the woman who had built it from the dirt up. I am Alicia Aravna, and this morning the sun is finally shining on the owner of the world.